Since the coronavirus lockdown became a daily feature of our lives, a number of commentators have speculated about the future of economic liberalism. Many on the left and some Muslims have concluded this period will presage the end of capitalism and the dawn of a new economic order. Such claims fail to live up to proper scrutiny. Instead, we may be witnessing the decline of America's position as the global hegemon, and with it, the fragmentation of the liberal world order. My guest today, Riaz Hasan, is a writer and community organiser. I discuss the political and economic ramifications of the crisis. We look at the decline of America, the move to embrace the Chinese model of capitalism, and whether a realistic and well thought through Islamic model currently exists to meet the demands of the 21st century. I begin by asking him about his thoughts on how Western liberal governments have dealt with the looming economic crisis.
Well, I think in terms of how people have dealt with it is also there's changes in the same countries dealing with the crisis over the last few weeks. I think it's quite apparent that people have changed their stance from the British government and the Americans. So even if you look at the American government stance on Trump, and I know his quotes are very easy to pick up on, but I think on the 12th of March, he suggested, and I'm quoting here, he said, "The virus will not have a chance against us because we have put in place the most aggressive and comprehensive measures to confront this virus, to confront this foreign virus in modern history." So that was on the 12th of March.
Right.
And if you kind of compare that against what the press conference was yesterday, which was on the 31st of March, there was a complete about turn in terms of how they were looking at the same issue. And although
I hear it was a pretty spectacular conference. Did you watch it live?
Yeah, I watched the conference, and it was quite attritional and quite as if there was a level of confusion. There was a level of kind of unknown factors involved there. There was quite a lot of self-admittance as well. And the great thing about it is in that press conference, there was hardly any pretense as to what was going on. So it wasn't covered in kind of a political cloak of, this is the situation as we want to present it. It was kind of real. And the questioners from the journalists were kind of real as well. And they kind of smelt of a real sense of desperation, really, from the way they were talking. And just the figures, this is the first time that a projected amount of deaths.
Upper end, what were they saying, 200,000?
I think they were saying upper end of 200,000, and that's with social distancing, and the lower end of 100,000. So that's like, I don't know how many 9/11 deaths that equates to, but that's just phenomenal in American history. And that's what I think caught people off guard on that press conference. And now whether they're trying to do that in terms of kind of set expectations of people at the upper end so that when they come in lower, it's counted as a success or not, it's hard to say at this stage. But certainly there were some real revelatory facts at that press conference.
Can you bring us up to speed with how governments across Europe and America are economically dealing with this?
Yeah, so if we take America in the first instance, so the stimulus package of, I think it was below 2 trillion, I think it was about 1.5 trillion or something. Now, again, as you rightly say, most of that money, I think there's indications of between 60 to 65% of that money is going to the survival of corporations, rather like it was done in the end of the financial crisis, really, where Obama had the stimulus package, but most of that stimulus package was to uphold corporations, the banking sector in particular, and the insurance sector, and the automotive industry. In a similar fashion, these packages is there to uphold the basic framework of the economy, which are the corporations. There is, obviously, there is a large amount of unemployment because the unemployment figures that came out, I think, about a week ago, showed a sharp increase in terms of the US jobless figures. And a lot of these measures, although the headline is that a lot of these figures are going towards the jobless and there's a check being posted to every household in the United States.
So-called helicopter money.
Yeah, the helicopter money, which is, I think, in the region of about $3,000 or something like that. It's really pittance compared to the bailout that's going to occur for the major corporations.
Right.
And that's very similar and analogous to what happened after the financial crisis, because if we look at it as a sense of priorities, that's really where the priority is. And the other stuff is a bit of window dressing, really, in terms of the stimulus package. But I think what I wanted to just kind of look at is the future projection of the economy, because I think once we look at the States, and also is similar to the British package that we have here as well, there are going to be various factors which are kind of going to come to the fore very, very quickly. So the supply side of the economies are going to be really struggling when, the factories have been closing, the shops are shut, all the service industries in terms of restaurants, airlines, holiday makers have all been shut down. And even for them to restart, there will be there's a loss of momentum. It's not easy for businesses to just set up shop again from day one. And then there's a decrease in demand. So consumers, even when this present crisis is over and things do open up again, and the holiday resorts do open and the airlines do open, the lack of confidence or the loss of confidence in terms of people returning to those things is just going to take a long time to kind of regain, I think.
Well, what are your thoughts on the situation across Europe and in particular here in the UK? The Chancellor Rishi Sunak, he announced a few weeks back a 30 billion package to deal with the coronavirus problem, but that was increased tremendously, right? So when he finally announced his package, it was to the tune of 300 billion, and I think it will probably go up when we think about the welfare burden that will be placed in the next few weeks. I mean, what's your perspective on how these governments are dealing with the crisis, and whether the measures they've put into place, let alone the state intervention that they've always said is a problem for capitalist governments, for capitalist economies, but how are these governments dealing with it? What's your assessment as to the way forward for them?
Well, I think it seems like all rules have been thrown out the window. So it seems that on the face of it, that the Chancellor's very famous comment about "we'll do whatever it takes," which was incidentally borrowed from Mario Draghi of the ECB at the time of the South European financial crisis. But this,
he also said, there is no ideology now.
Yeah, exactly. Which means, what does that mean? Boris Johnson's government has become a socialist government. What does that actually mean? But it's almost as if whatever it takes means just borrowing more, and that's why they reduce the interest rates, obviously, to 0.1%. So that, in effect, is it's a delaying factor for the economy. Some of it's real money, and some of it is not real money. So the stimulus of about 30 billion, I think, which you described in various ways for furloughed employees and for self-employment, some of that is real money, but a lot of it is loan money, which is repayable and deferred payments after the event, after 3 or 4 months, 4 or 5 months. So even rental payments, if you can't pay, they're still owed, but they have to be paid later. So a lot of these factors have been dressed up in many ways. But you're right, the economy, for that amount of borrowing, does mean that, rather like, again, the analogy with the financial crisis, is that we will have a period of sustained repayment of that debt by both households in the country and by the government. So then we're in for a period of stagnation again for a number of years.
Now, do you think that there are broader conclusions we can draw at this stage? I'm thinking of the I mean, a lot of people on the left have now surmised that capitalism as a economic system is on the brink of collapse, and the oft repeated saying of Francis Fukuyama that liberal democracies and capitalism, liberal economics, would be the inevitable system for mankind forever. Right? We had reached the end status of human history and human development, and there was only now one ideology that really was able to provide for human beings. And I'm following and reading articles from the left, and the American left in particular are talking about the demise of capitalism, and Paul Mason here and many on the left here are talking about a post-coronavirus world order or coronavirus economic system. I mean, what do you make of such claims?
Well, I think where they generate from is again from if you look at the economic outlook, a lot of commentators have kind of said that the prescriptive orthodoxy of macroeconomics, as we previously understood it, doesn't really hold true anymore. So what they're talking about is things like levers of interest rates or pricing mechanisms and movements to generate demand actually don't hold true in a world where there's a loss of confidence and a loss of in terms of the way we used to live and the way we will live. In terms of what people see as the role of capitalism and how that would work. Now, capitalism is a funny thing because people made similar comments at the end of the financial crisis as well. And there was and if you remember the Occupy movement that kind of arose after the financial crisis, where Wall Street was occupied and St. Paul's Cathedral, I think, here as well. A lot of these movements, along with things like the Arab Spring that happened in the aftermath of that, and then maybe the environmental lobby that's occurred recently, a lot of these things have been well-meaning and have always been kind of harbingers of change, and people have kind of bought into that idea or the idea of hope. But what's actually transpired is that they've mostly evaporated away. And capitalism, someone actually said, and I can't remember whether it was Adam Curtis or some people of that ilk, have actually said that capitalism is not actually evil in its essence, it's amoral, which means that it kind of subsumes or absorbs these movements into its path. It kind of, looks at them and looks at the public mood for change and kind of absorbs it and just kind of repackages it up. And you can kind of see that with things like the environmental lobby about sustainability and the green movement, and how that's kind of transpired into products on our supermarket shelves. So I think it has the demise of capitalism is something that needs a bit more thought and understanding. And I think I'll put commentators into two camps: the optimistic camp, who are people like Paul Mason, and people on the left who want to see that things have changed and that this is a precipitous moment and things will inevitably change. And then those on the pessimistic level who probably understand that capitalism has this kind of age-old method of absorbing changes like this and absorbing the public mood into its path. And that's where the two camps sit. And in addition to that, I think there's also been commentary and there's been analysis on the fact that indicators of economics, things like GDP or things like growth statistics, have actually now, there's an intellectual movement or a kind of a grassroots movement in order to change those indicators of success, if you like, to economics should be based upon, sifting through and upholding social cohesion, or economics should be about health economics, and then you would suddenly need, health visas to move from one place to the other, or there'll be a restriction on capital flow. So there's a number of factors that come in. And I think allied to that, the one last factor that I want to discuss is this issue about industry in general, because a lot of the problems that the Western countries, especially the European Union and the United States, have faced has been because of a decentralization or
Deindustrialization,
deindustrialization or a distribution of labor. So when you look at Adam
yeah.
Smith and the Wealth of Nations, it's about the distribution of labor between specialized tasks, and that's taken to a completely different level in the globalization world, where it's almost like a distribution of specialization to countries like Korea and China and India and so forth. And that's actually led to this thing, what they refer to in industry as, inventory, in its essence being evil, as Tim Cook of Apple has stated. And what that means is that they do things like just-in-time production, where things are just shipped over in time. And now
nothing is warehoused anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And warehousing is seen as a expense that can be done without, and we have new technology and modern systems that go to the nth degree of minimizing this warehouse into very intricate terms.
Well, let's come back to globalization, because I think that's a really interesting idea you've raised there, and I do want to explore that further, because even Francis Fukuyama was on radio the other day talking about the trend towards deglobalization. But I mean, maybe Francis Fukuyama is a good segue into the following, and that is that I totally agree with you. I think that I would go even further to say that these predictions that capitalism is about to fall are wildly over exaggerated, because capitalism is very resilient, but also it's very unspecific, right? After the Second World War, capitalism went through a transformation and adopted some of the social democratic values, which incorporated limited nationalization and a broader welfare state, at least across Europe. And so, it is able to, as you quite rightly said, it's able to consume, or it's able to subsume the trends that are out there and able to accommodate them, but remain fairly robust. And I think after the 2008 crisis, I remember reading books about the fall of capitalism. None of that came true. I mean, it seemed to me that capitalism bounced back, and I hate to say this, but I think it's based on a very superficial analysis. It's a hope rather than a reality. But I would say that there is something additional which this crisis has unfurled, and that is that liberal democracies have been pretty poor at dealing with this problem. Now, partly it's because of its reliance on the East for a lot of key supplies like face masks and chemicals and the rest of it, but also partly because its decentralized structures, its reliance on individualism, its inertia when it comes to dealing with things in a slightly more authoritarian way, all of that has come to harm it, right? I mean, just think about closer to home, Boris Johnson's government. For the last month, it's been dithering, and even a simple task of calling a lockdown here in the UK took the government 2 or 3 weeks to enact, because they initially relied. I mean, Boris Johnson said it, we live in a liberal society and we don't need to force people to stay in their homes. We need to advise people. And there was a lot of reliance on this nudge unit, it's behavioral science. You're able to get people to change their behaviors by incrementally telling them what's good for them, and they would rationally respond to that. All of that failed, right? I mean, it was only when Boris Johnson finally went on TV and was able to express in no uncertain terms that this crisis is actually a real crisis, and if you don't stay in your home, it's going to cause a more severe crisis that people partially at least took note. I mean, I say partially because it's still not the case that this lockdown is holding, and there are pockets around the country where people are can't see it, right? And they don't believe in it. And so they're sort of, it's business as usual.
Yeah, and I think the Trump conference yesterday was akin to that Boris Johnson moment,
Really,
is where he
right.
suddenly, I think there was a sudden realization that, this is not going to be over by Easter.
It dawned on him, did it?
I think it did dawn on him and all of his advisors and all of the journalists that were present. It was quite a telling press conference yesterday. But I mean, coming back to your point about, firstly, I think
failure of liberal democracy.
Yeah, the failure of liberal democracy. I think, in essence, it's like the values have worked against it in this crisis. So,
right.
So freedoms, which you brought up rightly in terms of how we can do things by nudging people along. And incidentally, I think I read a report today that in Sweden they're still trying to do that. So there is no prescriptive law about social distancing in Sweden at the moment.
It's shocking, right?
Yeah, and they're still trying to maintain a level of that people will have the right behavioral context in terms of what they're doing, which is interesting to say the least. And how they pan out it will be interesting to watch. But I think one of the other things that kind of conspires against, especially a country like America, and if you look at the EU bloc in totality, is this issue of federalism. And if you compare that with kind of state capitalism in China, it's a complete difference. So you have Andrew Cuomo of New York, who said yesterday that, we're almost competing for ventilators. It's like being on eBay with other states. And the highest bidder gets the ventilator, and that was brought up in the press conference yesterday, for which there was kind of a very muted response. And it's not just that; it's what we see in terms of hoarding in our supermarkets, in Sainsbury's or in Tesco's or whatever, is kind of played out on a macro level in the European Union as well, where Germany doesn't want to release its respirators to Italy, neither to Spain or to anybody. In fact, you had the European Union, the dream of the European Union as this one kind of solidifying force where each one's interest is equal to all, just kind of suddenly been laid bare. And
it was the liberal dream, right? This was the utopia. This is what was the end of history, that countries give up on national sovereignty and work together for the benefit of the collective. And that seems to be falling apart all across Europe at the moment. Yeah,
and it's suddenly been just unpacked with one virus, and predominantly because it's an existential threat. Is the way people see it. So, they could argue, or people could argue on their point of views that it's such a life and death matter that we have to do that. But then again, the values that they espouse and the values that they abide by were there for all time, right? They were there that everybody had to buy into. And suddenly you see the president of Serbia calling out to China and exposing all the European myths about, even Serbia, which was seeking European membership, is saying that, this is just laid bare our kind of concerns about France and Germany and everybody else, really, in terms of handling the situation.
So there is a crisis, and there is there are competing models that are being presented here. You've got the Chinese model, which is a very state-heavy, centralized model, which works efficiently to deal with the crisis. Of course, the Chinese have lied about, probably have misinformed the public about the number of deaths, and I would imagine that the Chinese knew about the virus at least as far back as November, but only really released information in January. So, of course, with all of those caveats, China has dealt with it in a far more efficient way because it was able to galvanize the resources of the state, and it worked in one direction. I mean, something like 40,000 doctors from across China were sent to Wuhan alone. In Britain, they can't even deliver PPE masks to a hospital, right? And they've been saying, I remember as far back as 3 weeks back where there was a health select committee hearing, and the Simon Stevens, from the head of the NHS, was suggesting that within 48 hours the distribution will be resolved. And yet we sit here today and doctors are complaining that they don't have vital equipment. I mean, think about the American.
It was Jenny Harries who kind of admitted to that as well in the press conference, I think 2 days ago, that they got their logistics wrong.
I mean, the American example is, as you said, you know, it's partly their structure, the federal system, but also there is disarray, right? You know, there is a sense that there is a lack of efficiency. I mean, this is liberal democracies are failing to deal with an unprecedented crisis, whereas authoritarian governments, or at least governments that seem to that have more centralized societies, I mean, I would include South Korea as part of this, have been far more proactive in dealing with the conflict. And I suppose my question to you, or my discussion point really is this really a game changer when it comes to the future of liberal democracy?
Well, I think the way to look at this, in my opinion anyway, is state capitalism has kind of dealt with this crisis obviously better than the way liberal democracies have. Now, there's two questions here. Is it by design or is it by providence that has happened? So when the crisis first started, the notion was that, you know, this was China's Chernobyl, right? It was a question of, this is going to destroy the growth of China. They haven't got a handle on this crisis. They're lying about the numbers. You know, we can't trust this. And it was almost people peering in from the outside on, you know, inside their windows and saying what a mess that they're made of things. And this was not that long ago. This was only in December and January. And that complete transformation from then to now has just been remarkable. It's just been, China has now been trying to export its soft power, is trying to play on the fractious nature of the alliances in the Western democracies by, you know, aiding Italy. I think there was 1,000 ventilators, 100,000 respirators being sent to Italy just by itself. And then also the interdependence on places like China, where you have, I think somebody said 95% of the ingredients of painkillers and antibiotics are made in China. So
yes,
there's an over-reliance on that kind of supply route there. But state capitalism...
so I mean, I would like to unpack that a little further, because it seems to me that what we may be seeing isn't, you know, the demise of capitalism. I think that's an over-exaggeration, but rather a choice between two models: authoritarian capitalism, or state capitalism as the Russians call it, or liberal democracy and capitalism, which is proved to be an inadequate system, or an inadequate combination when dealing with crises like global pandemics. And I think and I feel that I can feel that there is a substantial body of opinion which now believes that more of China is not a bad thing. I mean, just think about countries across the East who are measuring up the American mess and the Chinese efficiency. And I've probably concluded that it's probably better to have a government like China. I mean, even closer to home, you know, a few days ago, Viktor Orban announced state emergency powers, but in effect, it gives him unlimited powers. He has now become the Führer of Hungary. Yeah. He can now rule by decree. I mean, he had a 70% lead in the composition of parliament in Hungary anyway, so he could have passed wherever he wanted. But why even continue with that facade? It seems, you know, his approach now is to rule by decree and to unmask his authoritarian credentials. And I think that's been a long time coming, because Orban once declared that he would rather turn Hungary into a illiberal democracy rather than a liberal democracy, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it goes even further. So even if you look at the standard bearers of Western liberal democracy, France, England, or Britain, or the United States, you could even argue that populism in its very essence is kind of, you know, bumping against this idea of state capitalism, or is kind of, you know, implementing policies which you wouldn't see in a normal liberal democracy. So even the likes of Trump's and his policy and his disregard for institutions, or even in France, what we see now is people going around with pieces of paper trying to justify, you know, going outside, or the measures that are in place in Britain and all over Western democracies. You could even argue that these are measures for this time, yes, but, you know, how long will they last? People are afraid that, you know, the actual freedoms that they were used to are being trampled upon. And you could even argue that there is a tendency within populism to drive towards that kind of ideal model of state capitalism. But my question to you in return is this: does state capitalism offer people something that they don't get within the traditional model of liberal democracies, in terms of, does it still give people the freedoms that they're used to? And do people value those freedoms enough? So at a time like this, yes, it's attractive. And yes, we can see, because people ultimately value life and security above all else. So they can see the benefits of a China model in terms of restricting it to Wuhan, as opposed to something like the States, where everything seems out of control at the moment. And, you know, Midwest is doing its own things, California is doing its own thing, and whatever. But people's memories are also short as well. So does this model, because we're in the situation that we're in, offer that hope to people, because it appeals to their sense of security and their instincts of survival? But when the crisis is over, will people still uphold those kind of values? Will they still agree in terms of their social contract with the state to this trampling upon their very essence, or the freedoms that they were used to? Because that's an interesting precept for the future. I'm not sure how that will kind of turn out.
Well, I mean, I think that is really interesting. I mean, for the last 200-300 years, I suppose the you know, the intellectual opinion was moving in the direction that suggested that people want freedom. You know, if we go back to the Lockean ideal, the John Locke ideal of a social contract, that your government's responsibility is to secure your rights, and if your government doesn't secure your rights, in your freedoms, your liberties, then that government is an illegitimate government. I suspect that concept is at least now being contested around the world. I'm just thinking about the China model, and I really think there is a China model. I mean, I have surmised that sometimes analysts overplay the value of comprehensive ideologies. And I've spoken to a lot of Muslims, if we want to, think about it more closer to home, who suggest that only comprehensive systems can really succeed, and the comprehensive system would be something like liberalism or communism or Islam, and in our context, right? These are systems of belief which encompass a number of areas, and I don't quite buy that. I mean, I think that a model is only as good as whether people follow it, and China has promoted a model. It is a state capitalism, so it's capitalism without the liberal democracy, and China has very effectively achieved a degree of economic prosperity without having to release the reins of political power. I mean, 30 years ago, the total growth rate of China was equivalent. The total economy of China, GDP, was equivalent to the Netherlands, right? Yeah. And today, it's just its GDP growth is equivalent to the Netherlands. And so, China has grown rapidly over the last 30 years.
But So I was going to say, do you think, because I'm quite of the opinion that it depends on what China wants to do, because I think that's an important question, because it's really understanding what it has in its mind in terms of where it wants to be in the world. Because traditionally, when we've thought of China, and I wrote something about this 10 or 15 years ago, where China was seen in its infancy, as it was during the growth stage with Deng Xiaoping, who was introducing state capitalism in its various forms. The role of China, or the objective of China at that stage, was to promote this form of capitalism within its borders and with the rest of the world. But in terms of its geographical impact or its global impact, was it saw as its end objective was to control the South China Sea. And it saw America or the United States as a competitor to that in terms of its degree of influence of the nations around it, be it the Philippines or Vietnam or South Korea or Japan. And that's what its end objective was. Now, in terms of whether that's changed, whether with things like the Belt and Road Initiative or the Chinese debt trap that African countries and Sri Lanka and stuff have been kind of fallen prey to recently, whether that's become more global in its outlook, or whether it wants to kind of attain that level of significance, is I think an issue which kind of will pan out with time. But I think also the issue about, we see America as a declining power, and I don't think there's any kind of much debate about that. Even the State Department, I think, kind of recognizes that. There's people in the State Department who say that the demise of America is not really a question of debate. It's really about trying to manage that demise in the face of rising powers like China and to a certain extent other powers. But it's a question of where does China want equivalence? Does it want to overtake the states? Because every society, I mean, the American society and liberal democracies, they have a self-preservation kind of switch within them, which is about, being the dominant culture, having the dominant values in the world. So my kind of rhetorical question back to you is what does China want to see from the world in terms of that aspect?
Well, I mean, China's intentions are somewhat opaque, and it's hard to pin down what its intentions are. Although I think analysts who follow the speeches of the philosophy of Xi Jinping would conclude that he's been far more assertive. Especially, I mean, China since the financial crisis has been far more willing to call out the structural problems in Western societies and its heavy reliance on debt and its, certainly over the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic is an interesting example of how China is asserting its influence across the world. China has used its Belt and Road Initiative. And remember, this is a network of infrastructure and trade projects all across principally the eastern, it's
the old
eastern
Silk
region.
Route, and yeah,
exactly. But even further afield, right? China has used that influence. I mean, there are at the moment 8 countries in its immediate region who depend on China. I mean, Pakistan, its overall GDP, its yearly growth of over 45% of that intake. Of that income comes from some sort of trade it has with China, and that is likely to grow. I mean, and that's not just immediate countries. A large number of African countries are stronger trading partners today with China than they are with the European Union or America. China is buying influence through a number of means, by using its economic might, but also by debt diplomacy. As America is hunkering down and trying to deal with this looming crisis, America is failing to lead the world in resolving the problem because it's sinking in its own problems at the moment. The European Union is deeply divided over this crisis.
I think with America, it's also the fact that it's trying to. It doesn't have the. It seems as if it doesn't have the desire to kind of lend its weight around the world anymore. It kind of wants to do things by remote control. So even if you look at previous crises and it's the previous tensions that were there between the United States and China, whether that was trade tariffs or whether that was a Belt and Road Initiative or whether that was any other contentions like North Korea or Japan or anything. The United States was simply calling out China. But it wasn't really doing anything to stop its kind of reemergence, or maybe it was incapable of doing anything to do that. But again, just going back to the examples that you mentioned about China's sphere of influence and what this crisis has brought a kind of a quickening of that process, really, not just within its immediate vicinity, but also in countries like Italy, who were even before the crisis kind of heavily.
They were champions, right?
They were champions of the Chinese model.
It's the first G7 country that joined the Belt and Road Initiative.
Exactly. And then you have countries like some of the former Eastern European bloc, like Hungary and Serbia and so forth. Yeah, so there's definite influences there. But again, it's still, in my opinion, it's still too early to tell whether the ambitions kind of pan out in that way, because ambitions can be twofold, right? They can be economic in terms of creating that debt trap for these countries and having that exorbitant amount of economic influence. But then in terms of values or in terms of what people want to uphold and the kind of things that people aspire to, has that really changed in those countries? Has it really changed in Italy about, what people want and how and where and how they look to those kind of championing of those values? At the moment,
interestingly, the former leader, he recently resigned of the Five Star Movement, which is a coalition partner. He openly suggested this past week that China has helped Italy more than the European Union has ever helped Italy over this crisis. China have sent in doctors and equipment, ventilators and face masks, and helped Italy to deal with this sort of formulating strategies in relation to the crisis. So I agree with you. I think it's premature to say that China will sometime soon replace the influence of the European Union or America in a number of these countries. But certainly, I think it's buying influence, at least amongst the political elites or political parties in these countries. The Serbian president, he said a couple of days, last week, in fact, he openly said that. Remember, Serbia is one of the candidate countries for membership of the European Union. It's part of the European Union's neighbourhood scheme, and he openly said that China was more of a reliable partner than the European Union. And so what we have here is, we have got China very overtly trying to use its soft power, its influence in these countries. It's akin to the Marshall Plan, right? Which America rolled out after the Second World War, where America was able to, in essence, buy influence in a number of European countries by debt and by handouts, by grants and by
re-raising
by
the
aid.
Infrastructure of those countries.
And exactly. And I think China is trying to do that. Now, in direct answer to your question, what is China's real motive? What it seems to me that China is seeing this as an opportunity to influence a number of countries. But I think China's critical sphere is the Asia Pacific, and what China wants to do there is it has a twofold objective. It wants to kick America out of these countries and kick its influence out of these countries and reduce America's political and in future military influence. Because remember, America has stationed a large number of its military personnel all across the region. But also, China wishes to replace that vacuum of the absence of America with Chinese influence and with a belief. It wants to spread the belief in state capitalism and a belief in the Chinese model. Imran Khan, something I know you're familiar with, Prime Minister of Pakistan. He talks about the Medina model, and maybe we should talk about the Islamic side of this in a bit, but he talks about the Medina model. But if you read his speeches, he talks about the China model more
I think
than the Medina model.
Is a camouflage for the Chinese, for the state capitalism, really. Yeah, but
right.
I think obviously time will tell is how this pans out. But I think one factor that we shouldn't underestimate either is the U.S. role in this, because even if you look after the financial crisis, the U.S. economy was surprisingly stable, or it was actually growing to a certain extent. And even after Trump, I mean, whether that was Trump by design or by luck, it was still growing, and it was doing rather well compared to the European Union and to anything else. And that was his projection. And then the U.S. military might, as you rightly pointed out, in the South China Sea is still a formidable force. And even though China's military has expanded and its influence has expanded, it's still no match for U.S. concerns in that area. And that, can, and so how that kind of pans out, and whether soft power has a view on that, it's still a formidable opponent for China to look at, and it's something that China can't ignore completely. It has to take it into its calculations for whatever it wants to do, whether it's on the global stage or even on a regional stage within the South China Sea. And I think that's kind of, it's a multifaceted approach that it needs to kind of take care of, really.
I mean, future prospects are, I mean, I think it would be a fool who tries to predict the future here, right? But I'm going to try to predict the future. But I feel that, certainly capitalism isn't going to fall as a result of this crisis. I think capitalism is going to be transformed. And I think a number of countries in the East in particular, but also, as we said, across Europe, are now looking to the China model as a more viable model of capitalism than the liberal democratic model. But what is interesting is, I want to pick up on a point you mentioned earlier, and that's deglobalization. For 30 years now, we've been reliant on these global supply chains, and countries, have followed the Ricardo model of specialization, where, you do what you're good at, and you can rely on your neighbors and your global partners to provide the gaps in your economy, to service the gaps in your economy, right? And that model has been severely tested in recent days and weeks. And I think it is fair, it is correct to say that, it's not just because of this pandemic. Just consider the trade wars that Trump has fought
the tariffs and
China and
so I think in terms of trade, and I think you're right, because one of the most primary things that was kind of painted out by economists and commentators at really the start of this crisis was the issue of slack and the issue of redundancy in the economy. And they suddenly found that there was no redundancy in the economy. There was no storage. There was no inventory of anything. In fact, I think you pointed out to me previously that at the beginning of the crisis, China bought all the masks from the States. And then during the crisis, China used them up or had them in store. And now the state and the companies that supplied those masks are short of those masks. So it's a case of a cyclical kind of transfer of just-in-time goods, really. But I think one of the things that they've kind of quickly realized is that redundancy and this kind of race towards maximum efficiency with maximum kind of minimization of waste has actually been a major drawback in terms of the way they've dealt with this crisis. So now I think what the models that have been proposed is things like what they're talking about is reshoring. So which reshoring is what the old Trump model, which means bring the jobs back to America. Bring Apple back, and we don't have to use Foxconn in mainland China. We can build things here. We can build our cars back here, and so forth. But people have kind of identified that that's not a short-term fix. That's not something that can be just regenerated in an instant. And what people are talking about is this issue of redundancy, where the supply chain exists in its present form, but there's redundancy built into the present supply chain. So you still have Foxconn and you still have the Chinese factories building the products, but you just order more of them and you keep inventories, which is what they didn't do in the past. So that's a kind of a partial solution to the problem, is what they're talking about, these two models of, before reshoring occurs, or even if they need reshoring, is to use this model of redundancy where they simply order more stock and then keep it for crises like this in the future. And that's a model that's been painted out in discussions. But I think one thing is for sure is that the world isn't going to be the same before this, and the economy isn't going to be the same. And as I kind of pointed out earlier, macroeconomic models just simply don't hold true after this crisis. And whether we follow the optimistic model of some of the commentators, where they think there's going to be a major shift in how we measure success, and whether blunt instruments like GDP and unemployment are going to be the main factors on how we look at things, or whether economics is going to be a more widely encompassing field where they look at issues like social cohesion or happiness or health economics, and whether there's going to be free movement of capital flows. That's another interesting thing, because at the moment that still seems to exist, right? Currency trading still seems to happen, and there's been major shocks and economic kind of shock waves occurring in various industries over the last few weeks. Every day, every 2 days, there's another industry in trouble. I think today there were sharp falls in the banking industry in terms of their stock prices. So how that continues is going to be interesting to note. But I think that because capitalism in its essence, and especially the economic model of capitalism, is a self-preservation model, that's something that they will uphold before even looking at adverse effects on human life, because that's essentially what the stimulus packages were designed for.
I mean, it's been a fascinating discussion, and really I think there's a lot there to unpack further, and maybe we should do that in future conversations that we have. But you and I, we aspire to some form of Islamic model, and we believe that Islam has a view on these sorts of matters, right? And Muslims for centuries were contenders of the number one position in the world, and they designed a system which brought prosperity and happiness to human beings. And I think that's, no matter how you evaluate Islamic history, when you take the broad sweep of Islamic history, you see a state that brought happiness and wealth to large numbers of people, Muslims and non-Muslims. Now, that the absence of the Islamic system, but also Islamic thinking about, I mean, I don't want to be hypercritical here, but and maybe it's worth. I mean, we were speaking previously about a really great article by Ovamir Anjum on the Yaqeen Institute website. It's a great,
who you had on your show previously.
That's right, and he spoke about the absence of innovative Islamic thinking when it comes to providing an alternative to these dilapidated systems that we see, East and West, because we're no subscribers of the state capitalism model. Neither do we accept the liberal democratic model which is proposed by liberals here in the West. But I mean, I suppose my question to you is that, there is an absence of deep thinking about presenting an Islamic alternative. I mean, if I was to be critical, actually, I would say that most people who now endorse and it's not most, but some people who endorse an Islamic perspective tend to be quite empty of ideas and tend to be more aspirational than rooted in reality and depth.
Yeah, rather like the optimists of the left after this crisis.
Well,
Yeah.
well, I mean, isn't that a great analogy? In fact, I mean, could we not argue that, you know, I hate using this term Islamist, and it's a shorthand, and I hate it, and I think it's a inappropriate term. But Islamists, if we were to use that term, are analogous in a sense to the Western left, because they're talking about solutions which now don't accommodate this new world that we're living in, and
so
yeah.
I mean, I think I've got kind of two ways of looking at this. I think firstly, I think we have to recognize that there is an openness for change. So whatever this crisis has done, it's kind of precipitated that openness of change. So where the discussions about alternative ways of thinking away from left and right were kind of on the intellectual stage, or between certain kind of, far out actors really, or people just thinking blue sky thinking, and it's kind of brought that thinking to the forefront. So those radical ideas which people seemed impossible just a few weeks ago, or quixotic in their very essence, have just now become realizable and reality. So they say things are abstract until they become reality, and that's exactly what's happened here. Is things like mortgage holidays, things like handing out money and checks in the post to people, things that people were aspiring to on the intellectual left before, things like a universal basic income. So all of those things have suddenly come up to staring at people in the face now as viable options for life in the future and for societies to operate on. So I think all of that has kind of helped the thinking for change. And when it comes to Islam, I think what we've got a notion and what we've got a responsibility to do is to throw the hat of Islam in the ring with these ideas, because we can, unless you challenge new notions and ways of doing things, unless you present Islam as a viable alternative, it doesn't really get the press that it deserves, really. And if you just think about it in terms of notions, and I think what's often missing, and I take some of your points about how people think and how people have looked at Islam and the way Islamic thoughts have been presented. I think in my opinion, what the term that's lacking is a credible alternative. And the word credibility is really important, because credibility means that when you present a notion, it's immediately accessible
entertained.
to entertained and accessible to users in terms of how they can kind of relate it. So if you're thinking as an idea, and if you want to present it, you have to make it credible. And making it credible means that you have to measure it up to things like the coronavirus crisis that we have here, and we have to address it in detail as to how Islam would have responded to this, and how Islam, some of the detailed steps that it would have taken, both from our past in terms of when we face these crises, and how we would have handled the modern situations. Because sometimes there's a lot of commentary about how Islam faced up to these crises like the plague, and how Umar bin al-Khattab radiallahu anhu faced up to these crises in the past. And then the translation from there into how this happens into this crisis, that's what is slightly missing. And that's almost kind of glazed over or presented in very kind of superficial terms. And that's where we need to get more of the detail from and present that as a viable alternative.
But, I maybe just to echo your point, Islamic thinkers are often doing a disservice to Islam, because as you said, Islam should be promoted or presented as a realistic, viable option. And I'm minded to. I remember Claude Monet, who was one of the founders of the European Union. He talked about the value of ideas. And I'm paraphrasing it. I'm probably paraphrasing very badly, to be honest. But ideas are developed, and the time for that developed idea comes about, almost as if the time is a bus that's coming along, and if the idea is ripe and ready, then someone's going to pick up that idea, right? And he was saying that in the context of the European Union, when he spoke of the European Union and the notion of a body of discrete countries that can come together and pull economic and political sovereignty, people thought he was crazy. Now, at least until very recently, at least, it was seen to be the most viable model for the future of regionalism. And so I suppose to get to the point I'm making in a very sort of long-winded way, I think that there needs to be the development of ideas. And that's really what I liked about Over Mir Anjum's article and that podcast the conversation that you referred to earlier. His point was we need to start, showing some creative thinking. We need to address these problems, and the coronavirus problem is one such problem, right?
Yeah, and I think alongside that, what he kind of rightfully did as well, from what I remember correctly, is there wasn't a sense of, it wasn't prescriptive. So he wasn't being, from what I read of his article, he was saying that, look, we need Islamic thinking. We need to understand the role of Islam in society. We need to understand how it would kind of manifest itself on the modern stage. But he wasn't prescriptive in terms of this is a step A, B, and C that you should take. I think what he was trying to get at was there needs to be a level of thinking and a formulation of these ideas, and they need to develop over time. And obviously with the right models, we can't just pinch everything out of the air because we're confined to what Islam suggests and doesn't suggest. But even within that realm, there's a lot of imagination and a lot of creativity that can be applied to modern situations, especially the coronavirus situation is an immense example of that, as to how not just, we should keep a distance and we shouldn't go into a plague area and we shouldn't come out of it. I mean, that's a very basic precept that we can take, but in addition to that, we need to understand also from Islam, how should we run our economy in this kind of situation? How would we have an understanding of how society would function? How what kind of values we would espouse to? How would we have relations with the rest of the world? So all of these aspects from a modern crisis like this need to be measured up with Islam. And I often think you're right. It's a bit of a disservice in that we just talk about the immediate issue, but we don't talk about the wider context of how Islam would approach this problem. And I think that's very necessary. And and I think also being too prescriptive too early is often limits people's growth in their mindset as well. So I think that's something that needs to be looked at. It doesn't kind of let the kind of rivers of imagination flow within people in terms of how and why they can do certain things.
Certainly. Well, look, Riaz, it's really been an interesting conversation, and I think these next few weeks are going to be quite a testing few weeks when it comes to this crisis, and the projections of deaths. Subhanallah, in Britain yesterday, a 13-year-old boy passed away in London, right? This is and 3 or 4 of the doctors that have passed away in Britain are Muslim doctors, and subhanallah, you look at these crises and you realize that the world needs better thinking and better leaders. I mean, can we cite a leader today, really? I mean, we can probably mention a very very few that have really planned for this crisis and handled it in an appropriate way. And there is a vacuum of leadership in the world, and as you quite rightly said, there needs to be some thinking about how Muslims and how Islam can serve humanity like we served humanity for centuries.
Yeah, and I think also, just in finality, I think the issue of ideas coming to the forefront is an interesting one, because it's a very timely reminder for us that there is an exploration of ideas now. There is a dearth of the present systems in terms of the way they've handled things and the way they want to kind of govern the world, if you like. And so the time is ripe for us to kind of step into that mode. And it's only by looking at things and examining things in detail that we will be able to do so. So although I kind of fully echo your points about, the distress and the trauma that we're all living under at this time, and, the deaths of loved ones and everything that's happening around us. But it also offers us a really good opportunity to think and to reflect, and then to almost change our behaviors and change our understanding of how and what we see as Muslims and what we see as Islam's role in the world as well.
And on that note, Jazakallah khair, Brother Riaz Hasan. It's been a pleasure to speak to you today, and we must speak again, and there are still some strands of that conversation that we need to explore further in the future, inshallah. But Jazakallah khair for your time today.
And Jazakallah khair for you for having me.